We're going to be talking about the McCormick Reaper, as you can see. And we always try to kill two birds with one stone. And this is one of those things. We're conducting a study of our McCormick Reaper, and so maybe that's the reason that we're going to talk about this today. So, as you know, for thousands of years, farmers planted around the world. Farmers planted huge varieties of crops, all different kinds of things. And it was always accomplished by many methods, and planting could be done over a long time span, but harvesting, which is what we're talking about today, was a whole different ball game, and it was a whole lot more difficult. And the reason was that when crops are ready to be harvested, when they're at their absolute peak, they have to be harvested quickly and right then, because they start to deteriorate right where they're at. So you have to pick them at the peak, and that makes harvesting, like I say, much more difficult. Back in the day, they used a hand scythe for years and years and years, and it was very slow work and very laborious. It took days to just do a small farm. And so therefore, something that I never thought about before was that as much as a farmer could harvest determined how much he could plant. Because if you planted more than you couldn't get out of the fields, it just went to waste. And so the harvest determined how much was planted. So through the years, many people had tried to find a solution to this. And one was a Virginia farmer by the name of Robert McCormick. And for over 2 decades, he had worked on inventing a reaper before, but he eventually gave up. And after he gave up, he had a 21-year-old son named Cyrus McCormick. That name is probably much more familiar to you. And he picked up where his father left off. And Cyrus had always shown a remarkable mechanical aptitude. And other than a short span of time when he was interested in music, his only passion had been inventing. And he had already constructed several things that had been very workable. And one was a hillside plow that was superior to any that were on the market. Now remember, this is Virginia. Virginia is very, very different than what we're used to in Iowa. Lots of hills, and so this was a very important discovery. Okay. This has been a day.
Yeah.
Karen and I have had our issues today, but thanks to Karen. Okay, so there we have a handheld scythe and a cradle, because later on they begin to use cradles to harvest. But again, backbreaking work, and farmers would be out in the hot fields trying to harvest their crops, and could not do very many acres in a day, that's for sure. Well, there we see the blacksmith shop that was on the farm, it was called a plantation in Virginia. And building on his father's ideas for his failed reaper, Cyrus had a working reaper ready to go by 1831. So think of 1831, Iowa became a state in 1846. So that is really, really early. In the end, by the time he was done, his reaper looked nothing like his father's, but he went on to make reapers on this 600-acre Virginia plantation where he was born. Now there you see a blacksmith shop, there was a sawmill, a carpentry shop with plenty of iron and hardwood, as his father had run a successful iron mine and foundries. And so he's not somebody who started with nothing, right? He had a wonderful place to do all of his inventing and to make this thing work. His right-hand man was his best friend, and he was a dedicated slave by the name of Joe Anderson on this plantation. So by 1834, Cyrus had secured a patent for his reaper. But in 12 years, he had sold less than 100 machines. So he decided that it was time for him to reassess. He went to Chicago, and he met with a man by the name of Stephen A. Douglas, and we've all heard that name before. But Douglas realized that Cyrus McCormick kind of seemed unaware that this invention that he had come up with, this invention that was going to change farming forever, was so important. And so he had long talks with Stephen A. Douglas, and they toured the vast grain fields of the Midwest, which were very different from the things that he saw in Virginia. And then he just sort of had an awakening, and he relocated his operation to Chicago in 1847. And Silas McCormick, the inventor, became Silas McCormick, the businessman. And the first thing he did was to pioneer a very startling innovation in the time. He was the first, supposedly, to sell his machine on the installment plan. So that had just never been done before. So there's a picture of his reaper. Now, according to a PBS website or a program entitled Chicago City of the Century, this is what they had to say about him. His sales improved because he guaranteed performance. He guaranteed the farmers that bought his machine 15 acres a day of harvesting, or they got their money back. He allowed them to buy on credit and pay over time. He educated his customer base with demonstrations, and he advertised with satisfied customer testimonials. These were all things that weren't being done back then. He set a fixed price for his machine. It was $120, and it was take it or leave it. He wasn't dickering with people over price. It was just a straight business deal. So he removed the hassle over money. And he did something else that was very important that had not been customarily done, and that is that he developed interchangeable replacement parts. And he had them readily available. So people who bought his machine all over the world could get replacement parts. He trained his men on the mechanics of the machine and on his business, and then he sent them out as what PBS called the very first traveling salesman. So you can see that he did a lot of things that are common to us now, but back then were maybe the first, or one of a kind. McCormick's motto is one price to all and satisfaction guaranteed. That's what he advertised. So, I'm sorry, my little thing is in the way. So we know in Jackson County that at one time, at least we know of one time, when Cyrus McCormick himself came to Jackson County, he came to the Miles area. He brought a reaper, and in the fields he demonstrated his invention. Then in 1851, McCormick won the gold medal at London's World Fair, and he was elected to the French Academy of Sciences for having done more for agriculture than any other living man. By 1860, he was selling over 400 reapers a year. 4,000 reapers a year, and he helped to make Chicago the greatest grain port in the world. But more importantly, what was he doing? He was making the American farmer much more prosperous than he had ever been before. Before, the farmer raised enough or made enough to support his family and buy a few incidentals. Now he was making the American farmer prosperous so that he could do a lot of other things. Something I came across when we were working on the Civil War had to do with the reaper. During the Civil War, which as you know was 1861 to 1864-5, it was said that because of the McCormick Reaper, the world marveled that the United States could field 2 large armies and still feed 35 million people. Europe did not see how we could possibly do that. But according to a story by Edward Myers in a 1999 Grit magazine, I think that's a Marine Corps magazine, he wrote that that was one of the ironies of the Civil War, that by taking his harvesting machine to the north and west before the Civil War, he gave the Union a real advantage in feeding their armies, and thereby releasing more able-bodied men to fight in the war against his native South. But by then, even he had chosen to fight for the Union cause, further putting him at odds with his Virginia relatives and friends. But he was definitely on the side of the North. We also talked, I think, last time about how another advantage that the North had over the South was they had coffee, right? They had coffee for the troops, and that gave them a fighting advantage. And that's in a Smithsonian magazine. They had done a lot of research and proved that. Okay, so in 1871, McCormick and his family were living large in New York. Had all kinds of fame and fortune, and they traveled the world, and they just had this wonderful, wonderful life. And that's when the Great Chicago Fire happened, right? The Great Chicago Fire completely destroyed his factory, his Reaper factory. So he regrouped, they sold their home in New York, they returned to Chicago, and there he rebuilt an even bigger and better factory. This is a man who never smoked, he didn't drink, he didn't curse, but he was a man that was obsessed with his business. When he died in 1884, his son took over and the company went on. And then McCormick Harvesting Machine Company eventually merged with their rival to become International Harvester Company, which you all know. Okay, if we fast forward again to 1893 at the Chicago World Fair, this is after his death, the company put out a very clever postcard. They handed them out to everybody that they could find. So people would address their postcard and send it home, and it said something to the effect that, I'm writing this from Chicago, and then it contained the following information about the McCormick Company. It said they make binders, reapers, and mowers, and their works, located in Chicago, are the largest in capacity in any of the world. They have over 50 acres of floor space. They employ over 2,000 men. They have facilities for building a complete machine every minute. And this means that an annual output of machines, if placed end to end, would make a column over 500 miles long. That is pretty outstanding. They annually, at this time, 1893, sold 1/3 of the world's needs in grain and grass harvesting machinery. And they have won the highest awards at every World's Fair and great exposition during the last 50 years. So it just gives you an idea of what an awesome company that this became. So in Jackson County, that's Ralph. I know a lot of you are familiar with Ralph Felderman. He was the last farmer in Jackson County to farm exclusively with horses. And the Historical Society is very fortunate because a lot of his artifacts are in our machine shed. A lot of his things came to us. But this is a picture that was in one of his scrapbooks. So, you know, there are no original reapers remaining because 1831 was a long time ago. They were wooden, they had heavy use, and they didn't last long. But there have been many attempts to make authentic reproductions of the McCormick Reaper. The Historical Society was really fortunate because we received a 1931 Reaper, in a replica of course, in 1994. It came from the University of Northern Iowa, and it came to us with conditions. And the conditions were that we always keep it in a climate-controlled environment, and that we always have it on display, and that we can never sell it, of course, and why would we want to? But it certainly is one of our very most important artifacts. And I hope that you have noticed it and appreciated it, but I have to confess it's not easy to understand, because we have it in such crowded conditions that you can't really understand how it worked and appreciate it. This is a large wooden display that came with it, though it's not listed on the deed. I'm sure it must have come with it, and it's displayed with it. But this is what it looks like in our museum. And so as you look at it, and I've looked at it a lot, and still to me it just looks like a tangle of things. It's hard to understand it because we have it so crowded in. So all of this is wood. You see all the wooden gears and all the things that made it happen. And then this is another shot. But again, can you look at that? And if you're a class of third graders going through the museum, it's pretty hard to understand because for space we have to have the, oh, I can't remember what they're called, that the horse stands between to pull it, point it up in the air. So it would be really hard for anybody to understand how this really works. So what we're trying to do is to contact the people that we signed the contract with at the University of Northern Virginia and get their permission to move this Reaper out into our machine shed, the Pennygroff machine shed on the fairgrounds. It is a wonderful, wonderful museum. It is so good that, as you know, for 2 days, RFD Farming, RFD TV, came and filmed our entire machine shed, and it is on YouTube for anybody who wants to see it. I asked them to please look at that, to look at our machine shed, to look at some of the wonderful wooden things that we have out there. We have early John Deere equipment that John Deere would like to have back because they don't have a replica. We have a lot of very, very neat things. But that's where the Reaper really fits in. We could attach it to one of our horses because we have 4 or 5 horses out there, you remember. And we could hook it up to a horse, and then when people went through the museum, they could really understand what it looked like and how it worked. So we're waiting to hear from them to see if we could be allowed to put this in our machine shed. So showing you this picture, this is Baldwin. As you can see, the Baldwin Bank in 1825. And I believe the man in the white is John W. Dusty Rhodes. And he was quite an important figure in Baldwin back in the day. And there's a newspaper article that's with our Reaper. It's from January 27th, Jackson Sentinel, 1931, and the headline reads, McCormick Reaper celebration to be held at Baldwin. Well, it was 1931, so that's the 100th anniversary of the patenting of the completion of the Reaper. And J.W. Rhodes was the McCormick Deering dealer at that time. And so he arranged for an all-day event on February 2nd of that year. He invited all local farmers from all around and their families to come for a full day's entertainment. There was a full-sized working reproduction of the 1831 Reaper on display. There were talks by important people. There were thousands of feet of mighty interesting motion pictures, it said. And there was free lunch for all. And it was quite a success, and hundreds of people came to this. The special feature of the day was said to be a 5-reel motion picture called Romance of the Reaper. And it was created especially for the anniversary of the McCormick Reaper. It was filmed at Walnut Grove, which was the old McCormick homestead built by Cyrus's father in 1822. The scenes that were in this were shot in the actual log forge shop, and the equipment used was over 100 years, the same used over 100 years ago. And then there at the end, there's some pictures of grain harvesting equipment as it evolved up through the 100 years to 1931. So thank you to Karen. She has figured out how we're going to watch this video. I'm ready. That was shown, this was the exact same film that was shown in Baldwin in 1931. And we just need to say that the Wisconsin Historical Society holds the print of an edited sound version of the film Romance of the Reaper. And Pat Jen in 2012 wrote to them, and they furnished us this DVD that we're going to watch at no charge to us. And we're allowed to use it in exhibits and educational programming and we hope that you will enjoy it.
Was the American scene in the summer of 1831. Little fields of waving grain, arduously planted, cultivated by back-breaking toil, and the harvest gathered with crude implements which had been little improved upon for centuries. Until recent generations, farmers were using the same reaping hooks and sickles that were employed by the ancient Egyptians. With a sickle, a man could cut only half an acre of grain in a long, hard day. Truly, mankind was shackled to the soil, engaged in an endless struggle for bread. Centuries after the sickle came the scythe. Now using both hands, one could still cut only 2.5 acres a day. Out of the scythe came the cradle, with long fingers to lay the grain in rows, and binding became easier. These three hand tools, the tools of famine, slavery, and failure, represented the entire progress of harvesting implements until just a little more than 100 years ago. In this peaceful setting, an event took place which was destined to change the entire course of agriculture and banish the primitive drudgery of hand farming. Here, in a valley of the Blue Ridge Mountains, was the old McCormick homestead. And here we shall see an historically faithful reenactment of the building of the world's first successful reaper. On this Virginia farm stood the old McCormick blacksmith shop, which became the birthplace of that instrument of freedom, the reaper. It was only a rude farm smithy where Cyrus Hall McCormick, at 22, worked on his invention. But he was impelled by the same driving power which has ever caused men with vision to plod on, until that which is only an idea takes physical shape. Others had tried to solve the problem of a mechanical reaper, for which there was desperate need. Over all the world, new lands were being opened to agriculture. The development of America was waiting for some better, cheaper way to harvest grain. And the tools of old were like so many ancient fetters on the limbs of men. Young McCormick, as a boy of 15, had already made an improved cradle by which he was able to keep up with able-bodied men in the field. Later, he invented a plow, which threw alternate furrows on either side. It was his vision of a new day on the farm which fired him to accomplish what had long been only a cherished dream in the minds of many men. A source of the young man's inspiration was his father, Robert McCormick, who had attempted to design a mechanical reaper as far back as 1816, and again in the year 1831. The elder McCormick had devised other machines for mill and farm, but the key to the riddle of the reaper was not to be his. Some of the friends and neighbors in the community were highly sympathetic and encouraging to young Cyrus. Such was Colonel James McDowell, full of faith in the boy's ability and perseverance. To others, such as Captain William Massey, the problem seemed impossible of solution. Skepticism characterized the manner and words of the captain. He typified the people of the day, believing it a waste of time and energy to try to create a mechanical reaper that would work. It was the firm conviction of such men that one must always see the toilers with their scythes and cradles in the fields. Undaunted by such cynicism and encouraged by the faith of his friends, McCormick persevered. With his only helper, the faithful servant Joe Anderson, he fitted each piece bit by bit as gradually a basic part took shape. The knife blade on which he worked was to be propelled forward through the grain, cutting it with a side-to-side motion. Out of this sliding of the cutting bar evolved a principle which has since been embodied in all successful harvesting machines. One interested observer was William, younger brother of the inventor. He visited the shop and field many times while the frame took shape around a great wooden bull wheel. This main wheel was designed to carry the weight of the machine and to impart motion to both the reel and cutting blade as the machine was hauled along the ground. Captain Massey had called it a contraption. No doubt it was a strange creation to one who could not visualize how all these parts would work. Other interested spectators were the two younger brothers, Leander and John. The workshop was to them just another spot in their rounds of play over the serene and comfortable home farm. It was with only the usual fascination of young boys for mechanical oddities that they watched the work progress. But there was one who had unbounded faith in Cyrus, Mary Ann Hall McCormick, his mother. Full of solicitude lest he exhaust himself, she was proud of her son's desire to finish his work in time for the present harvest. For in that day of tedious toil, many days were required to cut the grain, and as always, it must be gathered at just the right time. It was the farmer's greatest dread that once the grain was right for cutting, the weather wouldn't hold fair until he got it in. With this in mind, McCormick kept at the job constantly, hardly stopping for meals. While the elder McCormick had abandoned his own effort to build a practical reaper, he was intensely interested in the progress of the work under the hands of his son. Cyrus McCormick began at the point where other inventors had failed. Others who had tried to devise a reaper had relied on knives which worked like a scythe, or on a rotary cutter, or on one which worked like vibrating shears. But McCormick's sliding cutting bar was to prove the sound and lasting device which has prevailed in all of the reapers with which we are familiar today. But the knife alone was not enough to reap the grain which stood in prime condition. It was necessary to find a means of cutting that which had fallen and become a tangled mass. A reel would be needed, large enough to reach forward and pick up the low-lying stalks and carry them toward the blade. And so, part by part, under the inspiration of his sympathetic parents, the young inventor strove toward his goal. It was now approaching the end of summer. The short harvesting period always rushed by so fast that tons of grain often lay rotting in the fields under the hoofs of cattle. Cyrus could not wait for another season to go by. This workshop was a far cry from the modern laboratories and machine shops of today, where scientists, chemists, draftsmen, and mechanical engineers turn out the modern inventions of which our grandfathers dreamed. The materials of Cyrus McCormick's time were only the native hardwoods of the Virginia hills, and the pieces of iron, which had to be patterned and shaped by hand at the forge, were the crudest of local metals. The metallurgical knowledge we have today and the devices for cutting gears and casting metal parts were unheard of in 1831. Here was a young man who had never seen a railroad, had never been to college, using only such knowledge as he had gained on the farm and materials found at hand. In that early day, all the great basic inventions had great obstacles to overcome. The cotton gin of Eli Whitney, the steamboat of Robert Fulton, the sewing machine of Elias Howe, and on down the line of machines which did so much to change our lives and times, so much to add to the ease of living in the past 100 years. Day by day, the reaper grew from an idea into a machine. The fingers at the edge of the cutting blade solved one problem, that of supporting the grain while it was being cut. McCormick developed another important feature, which he called the outside divider, a curved arm to separate the grain to be cut from that which was left standing. With so many innovations, it was small wonder that the doubting ones were convinced that young McCormick was wasting his time. How could these various parts function all together? Wasn't it too much to believe that the main wheel, moving along the ground much like the tread of our modern tractors, could motivate these crudely shaped parts and make them work? Captain Massey thought so, but the determined inventor felt safe in declaring that within a few days' time, before this harvest was over, they would see this machine really cutting grain. At last, the day for the public test arrived. Cyrus's own mother and father, the boys and his sisters, Amanda, Joanna, and Mary Caroline, had already gone to the appointed place. Colonel McDowell's family, loyal and hopeful, were among the first to start for the field. We can easily believe that Captain Massey was not the only one who traveled to the neighboring field, convinced that a failure would be witnessed, and one more man mocked with derision as a crazy inventor. Naturally, the projected experiment had been noised about the countryside. Farmers, villagers, and their families trudged for miles to take in the show. This was going to be just about as good as a circus. And of the farmers and field hands, probably more were prepared to have a good laugh that day than to applaud at the test of neighbor McCormick's newfangled grain cutter. Such as it was, the reaper was ready for its test. Last-minute preparations at the old blacksmith shop found Joe, as he hitched up, excited over the prospect, much more so than the inventor himself, who had gone to dress up for the occasion. But for every neighbor who found time to visit the field, several others felt they dared not leave the harvesting. The loss of any precious hour when the crop was ripe to be cut, with the danger of the grain becoming too ripe and breaking down, might be disastrous. Of course, the inventor would take a last-minute look at his creation to see that every part was ready for the first public appearance. The drive wheel, the reel, the cutting bar, all were in place. And Joe's important duty was to be the raker, drawing the grain from the platform which had been designed to catch it. Farmers whose backs were bent and whose fingers were scarred from the harvest labor glanced with contemptuous curiosity at the queer rig which was expected to cut grain without the use of hands. The barnyard doubting Thomases were not giving up their cradles just yet a while. No siree. It was only a rough Virginia road, but it proved to be young McCormick's road of destiny, his pathway to service for all humanity. The historic spot where the first public exhibition of the cutting of grain by a mechanical reaper took place was close by the old McCormick homestead. It was in a field of late grain owned by John Steele at the nearby hamlet of Steele's Tavern, where the fateful exhibition had been arranged. As family, friends, and neighbors gathered, waiting for McCormick and his reaper to appear, an air of curious expectancy was in the crowd. The confident ones and the doubters were on hand. Which would be right when the machine was put to the test in the waving grain? At last, young Cyrus and his lumbering reaper entered the field and moved down toward the place where the grain was standing. Part of John Steele's field had already been cut by hand. Now they would see whether McCormick's invention could do as well. Around the machine was eager to get a good look at the contrivance. Here indeed was a strange monstrosity. A pioneer, hopefully plodding westward with his few goods, his axe and his scythe, looked curiously at a scene which seemed to concern him little. He could not know, but transportation itself, as we know it today, waited there too to be swept on by the reaper. The onlookers wondered, why doesn't it go? Will it go? They would believe it when they really saw it work. Young McCormick's invention was actually reaping grain. To the amazement of all, that contraption which had amused the countryside was literally marching down the field, cutting grain just as clean as a whistle. The crowd saw with its own eyes a clean line being marked off by the divider, the reel pressing the grain down toward the blade, saw the stationary fingers hold the stalks firmly against the knife, the platform catching grain 6 times faster than grain ever fell before. They saw the ponderous creation jolting down John Steele's field on its big main wheel, and the stout gears which Cyrus had hewn with his own hands, impelling motion to all these fantastic parts. It was clumsy as an ox cart, but it reaped. It proved that the basic ideas which the young man had worked out were sound. Here was a scene to make historians wonder why most men had been content with the same farm tools which had been used for centuries, while the world was crying for bread. Here was a nation which had been established for more than 50 years, but so far no grain had ever been cut by machine. And today, we can realize the magnitude of the event when we consider that if we reaped our grain as the Romans did with sickle and scythe, it would require half the population to produce our bread, not to mention the rest of the food we eat. Here, indeed, was an eventful day. The world's first successful reaper. History had been made that day on a little Virginia farm. Cyrus McCormick's machine had cut as much as 6 men would have cut by the best methods in use before that time. The hopes and dreams of a father had come true through the genius, the will, and determination of his son. "Your reaper is a success," Robert McCormick told him, "and I am proud to have a son do what I could not do." Doubt and cynicism gave way to conviction. Even Massey was among the first to offer congratulations. And so the pioneer moved westward, followed by wave on wave of immigration. But none dreamed that their sons would see this machine, and others descended from it, the means of building up an agricultural empire in the West much beyond the horizon of their imagination. Crude it was, that first model of the harvesting machine of 1831. Nearly 10 years would have passed before McCormick was ready to make his first sale. To have invented it was not enough. There was still required that same tenacity to keep improving and demonstrating it, and to introduce it to a still somewhat dubious world. Through the years, the development continued, and by 1851, an improved cutting mechanism was added, and another feature, a seat for the raker. It was in this year that McCormick's Reaper took first prize at the London exhibition. In 1847, McCormick had established his own factory in Chicago, thus starting the world's greatest harvesting machine works. In 1855, the Reaper won the gold medal at the Paris Exposition. This was another step in the progress of the harvest, the self-raking Reaper, the first truly one-man machine. In 1858 came the Marsh harvester, cutting 10 acres a day. 2 men riding on the machine tied the grain by hand. This was the forerunner of the self-binding machines, because an elevated platform was arranged so that the grain could be delivered in the right position and in good condition to be bound. The first self-binder appeared in the 70s, a simple mechanism which consisted of 2 steel fingers that moved back and forth and twisted a wire band around each sheaf of grain. It increased the cut to as much as 14 acres a day, but the farmers were afraid that the wire would injure the cattle and get tangled in the grain. Something better was still to be found. The needed improvement was the first twine binder, an amazing thing for the period of the early 80s. Steel arms flashed a cord around a bundle of grain, tied a knot, cut the cord, and flung off the sheaf. With this machine, 1 man could cut and bind the grain from 20 acres in 1 day. The Reaper had long since been the wonder of people in foreign countries. During the Civil War, it was astonishing that the United States could support 2 armies and still sell enough grain to feed 35 million people. Now, with the development of power farming, came the tractor binder. The tractor not only drawing the binder, but also furnishing, through the power takeoff, direct driving power to operate the machine and binding mechanism. Now it was harvesting 35 acres a day, almost twice as much as any horse-drawn binder. A long step forward from the old wooden main wheel of 1831. Latest and greatest of all harvesting machines is the harvester thresher or combine, great-grandchild of McCormick's first Reaper. With its power, capacity, and all the refinements of those early basic principles, this giant of farm machines is far beyond the imagination of the people who watched that first simple Reaper. the fields the combine cuts and threshes and cleans in one operation from 18 to 50 acres in a single day. Beneath the clamor of the modern harvest is still the soft whir of that first reaper heard round the world. And great modern trucks gather the finished grain, another long step from the crude wooden platform where the yet unthreshed stalks fell from the blade of that early harvester. From cradle to combine, from drudgery to mass production on the farms, from worldwide want to worldwide plenty. Such is the romantic history which began with Cyrus Hall McCormick's invention in 1831, the romance of the reaper.
So I hope everybody will stop by the main museum one of these days and look at our 1831 McCormick Reaaper. It's a treasure for our museum to have. Thanks to Karen Brown for helping me with all this, and Mary for videotaping all this, and Sarah Jones for getting everything onto our YouTube channel, and all of you. Thank you.